What is up, everybody? We are at the end of the Daybreak preview stuff. We're going over water and solar today. If you haven't checked out my other stuff, well, just check out my channel to see all the other elements has gone over already. So let's just jump into it today. We're going to start with water today because there's a lot of solar and there's not a ton of water and they work well together. So let's just start with the water. First up is Eddy, a 4/1 for 1 water. When you cast this Eddy, you can change the position of an Elestral. When the player casts a rock and a hard place, you can special send this Eddy to Cerebus from your hand or deck. So a 4/1 that on cast changes position is already pretty powerful, and at 4/1 that's probably the best attacker in water we have outside of Galaxy. It doesn't work with Galaxy, interesting to note. However, when the player casts rock in a hard place, it will special ascend. It's pretty powerful. Basically, what that's going to allow you to do is Eddy plus rock in a hard place and maybe Poseidon in hand. We'll let you go like Poseidon, you go Eddy, change position of Elestral, rock in the hard place to say, hey, you're Elestral or you're Rune. Probably they're gonna let the Rune go. They might let the Elestral go, knowing that you're gonna get the special ascent out here. And then they'll go into Cerebus and pop the other one using the Poseidon and then attack for 2. That's a pretty powerful combo. It's kind of a 3-card clear 2 things combo. I definitely think Eddy is going to see a ton of play, especially with like Foamy, the ability to float into it, or just even just casting it out of hand to just swap a position to something to get over it is going to be pretty powerful. So this is a pretty aggressive water 1-drop that has the ability to go even more aggressive in its 2-drop. I think it's a really good card, and I think it'll, if not make a new deck type with Cerebus, help support things like the Chronodile ramp stuff that we're probably going to see going into Daybreak. Moving on, Cerebus. I just spoke about Cerebus. It's a 9/2 for 2. You can disenchant 2 water from your field in order to destroy a card. If it's destroyed this way, return up to spirits from your underworld to your spirit deck. The number of enchanting spirits are on that card. So if you pop a Zeus that had 4 on it, you're going to heal 4. Now, that is the high end of this card, and it does basically cost 2 on board. So it's a very difficult to cast Earthquake or Thunderstorm, so to speak, from board that has the upside of possibly healing you some spirits. So you can kind of equate this to like Kreisboar, or not Kreisboar, sorry, the Earth 2-drop Boar, where it's going to basically be an Earthquake on a stick. This is an Earthquake or a Thunderstorm on a stick with some upside because it's more difficult to get off because you're disenchanting from board. So maybe you get 1 or 2 triggers off of this card. I think the power of this card is going to really come from specialing it with rock and a hard place. Going a hard cast in this off like a water ramp might be a little bit more difficult, and I don't think it plays super nice with like Lockgon, since that deck doesn't get a ton of spirits on board. But I think there's also a world where you go into this over Lockgon, you special a bunch of little guys, get some heals off of them, disenchant from little guys, pop a card, attack directly. We'll have to see where it goes, but generally this card is going to have a weak Thunderstorm effect to it, where you're probably going to pop a Rune. But in those circumstances where they have a Divine Rune in play that you need to get rid of, or a big 3-drop that you want to get rid of and heal from it, it's a pretty awesome card. I definitely think this is going to make Elestral effect protection like Hammer Festus a little bit more relevant going forward, but we'll have to see how it goes. I think Cerebus is another powerful card just because you can special it and it really works with Poseidon super well, so we'll see what happens in the future. Next up is Porcutine. It's a 1 water 1/4. When this Porcutine is destroyed in battle by an opponent, they must either discard a card or expend 2. So you're probably putting this out turn 1, maybe turn 2 as a defensive wall your opponent probably doesn't want to attack into. They do get the option to discard or expend. Most of the time they'll likely discard because that burn does hurt. But at the same time, this is just a wall that your opponent can attack into pretty easily. The best use of this card would probably be like a late game if you search it off of a Foamy to kind of stop your opponent from attacking because they have no more cards in hand, so they're forced to expend. I'm not 100% sure on this card. I don't think it's going to be super great. It's definitely a cheeky one-of with like Searchers and Foamy and such. I just don't know how detrimental the discard or expend will be to players to not want to attack into it, but we'll have to see. I definitely think that the card is fine. But it does just give your opponent a ton of agency to remove it in another way, or just not attack into it, or just attack into it and discard a card they don't need, or a card they want in their underworld. So we'll have to see how that goes, but I don't see this card seeing a ton of play outside of being a 1-of for a Foamy toolbox. Next up is Coastalith, a 2/8 for 2 water. It's a Lith, so it's got a Lith cast. This Coastalith can be normal cast with 2 water if an opponent has at least 2 Elestrals in defense position. When you cast Coastless, you can special cast a 1 water Elestral from your hand. So what are you doing with this card? Now in the art, it obviously shows the Veritaqua. You know, you're saying that Veritaqua, just launching Veritaqua at their defense position Elestrals is probably pretty relevant. The fact that it does need to be from your hand, I think, hampers this card quite a bit. It's great at going pretty wide into a board that you just tsunami'd, stuff like that. Maybe you can play it with like Sandstorm, a Hibafin to try to make like a wind, earth, water shenanigans thing. The best thing going for this card is the fact that it goes super wide. It gets pretty big with the Galaxy in play that you can drop with this card. But in general, I think the 2 defense position Elestrals might be a little difficult to get consistently, except with Tsunami. So there's going to be kind of a dead card in your hand until then. I don't see it seeing much play outside of some kind of interesting water defense butt deck with Galaxy, where you're running Tsunamis and maybe Sandstorms just to force things into defense to just cheat out a bunch of Elestrals all at once. What are you doing with those cheated out Elestrals? Attacking is the unfortunate thing. So there's not a ton you're doing with this outside of just hoping you draw the cards you need and then hoping your opponent's things are in defense and then it's a lot of steps. It's a decent payoff, but it is a lot of steps, so I don't know how much play it will see. At 8 defense, though, it does stop a lot of aggressive decks from attacking, so even harder sending into this might make it relevant. Otherwise, I don't see it seeing much play. And last for water, we have Rock and a Hard Place, or RAP. RAP, R-A-A-H-P, RAP. Anywho, it's a 1 water, 1 lunar invoke rune. This Rock and Hard Place cannot be chained by counter runes. Target a rune and an Elestral in opponent's field. That opponent destroys one of them. So this is either a Thunderstorm or an Earthquake, and you don't know which one it is because your opponent chooses that. If you choose an Elestral and a face-down rune and they don't want the Elestral to die, they'll choose the rune. If they don't want the rune to die, they'll choose the Elestral, and vice versa. It's very interesting. It's a super thematic card. It's definitely giving your opponent a difficult choice because they're losing something in the process. Again, with Eddy, this card gets pretty crazy because you can special ascend into Kerberos with it, possibly providing extra additional destruction effects through this card in Eddy. The fact that it can't be chained does make it a little bit more useful, I think, than Earthquake or Thunderstorm, because now if you target a Gorgon's Gaze and an Elestral, they can't gaze something in response. It will get destroyed if they choose it. So I think this is a pretty powerful card. Again, kind of a Porky type, though, you're giving your opponent a decision, and letting your opponent decide what's best for them isn't always that great. So I don't think this takes over a place of Thunderstorm or Earthquake in any deck, but rather it supplements them or just goes with Eddy to do the Eddy combo stuff. Other than that, I don't think it's going to see much play. You definitely probably don't splash for this card over anything because Water Lunar is a little expensive on the Spirit deck, especially since there's not a bunch of Lunar support. So unless we see Water Lunar decks, it's just going to be a Water card for now, with the fact that you have to kind of tax it with the Lunar Spirit. So we'll see what happens, but I do think the card is fine, and it's really good if you can get the combo with Eddy. Other than that, it's just an interesting card in general. It's hard to evaluate because of the choice and selection, but I think it's at least decent. At least decent. That's where I'm going to leave it. At least decent. All right, now we're moving on to Solar. Now, I'm going to skip ahead in the Solar to go with the Solar Water stuff to keep on that train going. So let's start with Sundial. It's a 2-1 for 1 Solar. You can expend Solar to enchant water to your field. During your end phase, you can special send the Sundial to Novacore from your hand or deck if it's water enchanted. This card kind of plays like a Nimbug, where you're kind of putting into play and chanting it to ascend into its 2-drop right away, and then its 2-drop waits a turn and then ascends into its 3-drop. Kind of playing a Nimbug strategy in Solar Water. I don't think its Ascension is that relevant, but the fact that you can enchant water to your field is probably the relevant half of this. You know, just play it next to Dratagua, expend a Solar, throw a water into Dratagua to heal some. It's probably the best use of this card. There's really not much, unless there was more water receivers that this could take advantage of. Kind of like Poseidon, it doesn't seem to be that great. You might play with Kerberos because now you have ways to get more water on board to use Kerberos, and Kerberos will refund some of that water that you spent. So that's relevant. But I don't think this is that great. It's also like a weird janky Tadpuff that kind of normals itself, so you can't go into the special right away, but lets you ramp to a 3-drop the following turn if it stays in play, but it's a 2-1, so it dies. I don't think Sundial is that great, but it might be better when we get more water receivers in the future. Moving on to Novacore, 5-6 for 1 Solar, 1 Water. You can spend Solar Water in order to enchant solar, or water from your underworld to your field, and special send this Novacore to Chronodile from your hand or deck. So previous turn, you like end phase special this out, right? It's okay there. Expending solar water in order to enchant water solar from underworld to your field is pretty relevant. It's pretty easy to trigger that. I think if this card sees play, it's going to be like you're running Tadpuffs with like a Novacore 2 and then Chronodile. So you go Tadpuff and then Tadpuff special, normal send into Novacore, Novacore effect, get an extra water on it, go into Chronodile, Chronodile effect to pop something. That seems reasonable, but otherwise, like, the first card in this line is pretty mediocre. This guy is okay. It is pretty much like a Gorgon bait, where you just Gorgons it and then kill it. Its stats are really low, so it's going to die unless it ascends right away. And it does get a little expensive because you are expending 2 to use its effect, as well as you just expended 1 for Tadpuff, so you're expending 3 to special this into a Chronodile right away. Plus these spirits enchanting, so you're still looking at like that 6-7 range of spirits that you see quick ascends use, but a lot of cards to get there, and you don't have Poseidon, then your Chronodile is going to die. It's pretty expensive, so I don't think Novacore is the best way to do all that. It gets to be pretty expensive. You're better off just going Tadpuff, Poseidon Nexus into Chronodile, and then you have all the spirits you need, more or less, in the protection. So I don't think Novacore is great, but I could see it seeing a little bit of play with Tadpuff Ascension stuff to ramp, but otherwise, eh. And then Chronodile, the last water of today. It's water solar, 2 water, 1 solar, 8-14. You can disenchant a water from this Chronodile in order to target and destroy a card. While you have at least 6 enchanting water solar, this Chronodile cannot be targeted by opponent's card effects. It's Volt Tempest, but instead of doing burn damage, you're popping cards, so it's Volt Tempest crossed with like a Centaur. And that protection effect is a little bit more convenient than, say, Centaur, a little less convenient than Volt Tempest, because usually that Divine Rune is going to make up that difference in spirits. There's a world we have 4 or 5 spirits on this and a 1-drop in play to give it protection, which does give you some versatility, but generally that's a Volt Tempest effect. It's while Poseidon's in play, it'll be protected. Or even Apollo. You might run Apollo with this as well. It has some protection. I say really Poseidon because Poseidon will let you Nexus to this constantly and then disenchant. So it's nice that water gets a disenchant effect that's worthwhile for Poseidon to take advantage. I think Chronodile is going to be pretty strong because I do think it comes out really fast in water, and water can stall pretty heavily to get to the point where they can get those 6 spirits on board and then actually just special a bunch of things into play and then ascend over them to Chronodile, and Chronodile could pop something after the fact and then be protected. So I think Chronodile is going to be pretty powerful just for the fact that it's in water. If this was any other element, it might not see play because you're looking at like a weird Centaur again, but specifically because it's in water, I think this card's pretty powerful because you can ramp into it in so many ways and then take advantage of Poseidon really well to just disenchant and pop things. All right, now we're going on to the proper solar cards. Dratara, a 2/4 for 1 solar. You can Nexus 1 solar. When you do, you can turn 2 solar from your underworld to your spirit deck. So this is a Nexus Celestial in solar. Specifically, it only Nexuses 1, which is fine. I mean, you usually don't Nexus 2, but it does kind of slow potential early aggro plays where you're trying to load up spirits onto one thing to give it a bunch of damage to punch over to stuff, etc. So the Nexus 1's interesting, but not super hampering of anything. And then you can recover 2. So it's like Dratagua that you can Nexus to trigger it. Unlike Dratagua, you can Nexus to anything to heal 2. So while Dratagua can be repeated turn over turn, this can only be used once, but you don't have to load it up on Dratagua. So you don't load up all the spirits into one card to make that one card just Earthquake and you go even. So that is nice to see. I think the card is fine. It's going to be a Solar Nexus card. There's looking to be a decent Solar Nexus deck. So this will definitely be seeing some play in that. And when I talk about Solar Nexus, I'm talking about Lustragon, a 7/6 for 2 solar. You can Nexus up to 3 solar when this Lustragon receives 1 or more solar. In the Nexus, you can target and destroy a card. So like Latagon and Latagon, it has a triggered effect that can pop a card. Unlike Latagon and Locagon, this can trigger itself. So you can Nexus itself to multiple spirits, up to 3, which is interesting. So it kind of takes the Nexus 1 spirit from Dratara, puts it on itself so it gets the 3. And when it receives 1 or more solar, you pop a card, so you can Nexus off your Apollo to this, pop a card, Nexus off your Tara over to it, pop another card. Now, the downside of this card is you are loading all your spirits onto this card in order to destroy things. Meaning that if your opponent kind of cracks back with the Gorgons and then into an Earthquake, you're losing all your spirits pretty consistently. as well as all those spirits you nexus onto it. So I think it's fine. I definitely think there's going to be a good solar nexus deck given this card as a 2-drop. But we'll have to wait and see, because this combined with things like Altar and Circle really can go pretty hard, pretty fast, and board wipe. Kind of like how a lot of Gon can just go Ambrosia, 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 and pop a bunch of things. This can go Nexus, 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 trigger a bunch of things, and pop stuff. So we'll have to see where it goes. But I think Solar Nexus is going to be pretty viable just because of this card's existence. Alright, next up, Glimbat, a 2-1 for 1 solar. When an opponent activates a card effect that discards a card from your hand, you can discard this Glimbat in order to negate that effect and destroy that card. You can disenchant 1 from this Glimbat in order to draw 2 cards. So this is a hand trap. Now, Dan has said he doesn't want to put a hand trap in the game, but I think this one is fine because it stops a degenerate turn 1 play when you don't have an action yet of discarding a card from your hand. So this is a nice little Spark It sideboard option. I don't think it's good or consistent enough to side deck in outside of a deck that's already playing Solar. However, the fact that it can also just go into play and boom bat itself to draw 2 cards is fine. If there's a way in like that Solar Nexus deck to keep this on board, like Nexus 1 from Jotaro to it, disenchant, draw 2, keep it in play, do it again, you do have a pretty interesting kind of draw recovery engine inside of Solar with Jotaro and Glimbat, assuming you can keep them alive, kind of like how Aphros and Jotagua play on each other, but this is probably a little bit more of a safer bet than that. Just lower stats on these cards. Anywho, I think the card is fine. I don't know if it's going to see much play. It'll probably see a 1 or 2 of in the occasional Solar deck, and it probably will see side deck play as long as Thunder Nexus is powerful to just deal with those Sparkets and such. Because it's fine if you're playing, like imagine playing this instead of expanding to draw. Then you're looking at a fine deck. So definitely in the slower decks where you don't mind expanding to draw turn 1, you play this instead of the your expand to draw, and you're drawing extra cards. So it's not bad. Alright, next up, Novacore, 4-8 for 2 solar. Your defense position Elestrals cannot be targeted by opponent's counter runes. When a player casts a counter rune, you draw a card. I think this card is a really fun and interesting build around. However, I don't think it's going to be that great. The fact that defense position Elestrals can't be targeted by counter runes doesn't mean much. You're basically just stopping PTA and Gorgons. The fact that whenever a player casts a counter runes, you can draw a card, no matter what position this is the interesting part. So if you can combine this with your own counter runes and do some weird plays and shenanigans with this card, then this card will go off and potentially get you 3-4 cards maybe in the course of 2 turns. So I do like the idea of drawing for counter cards, but the stats leave a lot to be desired, and it doesn't really, its effect is kind of a nothing burger because your defense position Elestrals not being targeted by counter runes doesn't mean much. The best I see of this card is going into play next to like a Chronodile, but then your Chronodile is just going to get protection when you get 1 more spirit anyway, so that doesn't do much. Like if you can get this in play with another 3-drop that is powerful, that doesn't want to get hit by a counter rune, then maybe, but most of the 3-drops worth playing have protection. Additionally, you're asking to get a 3-drop and a 2-drop to play. That's really difficult, so I don't see this card seeing a ton of play, outside of like maybe some gimmick like counter control decks. Next up, we have Nebuleo, 2-1 for 1 solar. This Nebuleo gets 1 attack for each enchanting solar on the field. You can foretell 4 at any number of Nebuleo, Leobright, Celis-Leo, First Light foretold to your hand. Out of all the lions, I legitimately think this might be the strongest one. So it's a Tectorus, or a Volcaries. Effectively, it's a little bit weaker than that, but it has that effect. Additionally, it has the upside of you can look at the top 4 cards of your deck, rearrange them in any way you want, and if you happen to find another Nebuleo, Leobright, Celis-Leo, First Light in there, you get to add it to hand, which allows you to kind of get rid of some dead draws, like get rid of the extra Nebuleos, get rid of some First Lights, maybe use First Light to combo into something next turn. That's really powerful. So this could potentially draw 1 or 2 cards off that effect while also getting a stat buff from Apollo being into play. You could potentially play Apollo first, take a peek, and then take a peek again and grab extra stuff off the top, kind of helping you get digging through your deck faster. So I think out of all the lions, this is probably the best one. And we'll get to Lion 3 in a second. So Leo Bright, 7-5 for 2 solar. You can foretell 4. You may special cast this or special send this Leo Bright to a Celis-Leo foretold this way. It's a bridge. It's fine in the deck that it's going to be played in. Getting that set up for foretell effects is good enough. However, setting up for Celis-Leo, while simple enough to just First Light it to top a deck, stuff like that, I don't think this is a great bridge because you're probably just going to ascend two defensive Elestrals to Celis-Leo anyway, or do some Nexus shenanigans to get to Celis-Leo instead of Leobright. Leobright's a little bit more fragile to get to Celis-Leo with, the Gorgons and to Dense Fog. So I think it's fine. You might play it in a Lion deck, but I think there's better ways to get Celis-Leo out by using Nexus shenanigans, because we see a lot of Nexus abilities in Solar. And lastly, in the Lion line, we have Celis-Leo. Now, I know a lot of people have concerns about this card and yada yada yada. I'll go on this card in depth probably tomorrow in a shorter video just about Celis-Leo on its own. So I won't spend too much time on it right now, but it's a 13/10 for 3 Solar. You can foretell 4 and add up to 3. Add each Solar Celestial foretell this way to your hand. Then you may destroy cards in your opponent's field up to the number of cards added this way. That does not target, so your opponent does not get to know what you are destroying until the effect is resolving. The card is fine. I think the card's good. I think the card might be great. I do think there's some extra doom and gloom about this card. I'm going to go over this card in a separate video that will probably come out tomorrow or the next day to talk about just this card. So I'll save my rest of the commentary about this card until then, because there's a lot of commentary around this card. Next up is P-Gleam, a 1/2 for 1 Solar. When this P-Gleam receives 1 or more Solar, you can target an Elestral and set its base attack to 0 to unfazed. I don't know how much I like this card. I don't think this is that great. So you're setting base attack to 0. If anything has attack buffs, even a Stadium in play basically makes this P-Gleam useless. Like, there's so many ways where this P-Gleam just doesn't really do much. Like, you hit a Galaxy, or you hit basically a Tectorus or Valkyries or Neblio now, or anything that has a stat modifier from a Stadium, and it's not getting over it anyway. It's cute. It's interesting. It might see a one-of play in Solar because you can generally first light it to top a deck, then Apollo it into hand if you need to. But I don't think it's that great. I don't see this seeing play at all, even in the Nexus Solar stuff. Maybe you play as a gotcha in Nexus Solar where you go, haha, now you're attack 0 and you crash into me, but I hold my reservations. I don't think it's that great. Next up, Falliferos, a 6/7 for 2 Solar. You can expend Solar in order to reveal each of your opponent's face down runes, then destroy up to 1 rune revealed this way. This effect cannot be chained by counter runes. This is definitely, I think, a better Falcon, because the issue with Falcon is once you use its ability, well, it gets Gorgons or something. So the fact that they can't chain to this is pretty interesting. However, the downside here is they can still chain to its cast, so Gorgons or PTA, before you get a chance to use its effect to destroy things. So the effect to be not chained by counter runes doesn't really do much to this card, because unless it's literally already in play, they're just going to hit it anyway with their counter runes before you do anything. So I don't think it's going to be that great. It's definitely a fine card. It's definitely an interesting control card. The can't be chained by counter runes is a little bit of a, well, it can't be chained to counter runes, but in response window, before you get a chance to activate you can effects, well, hello, cannot be chained. You just hit it with the response window, so you can't even get to the can't be chained part. I think it's okay. I don't think it's that great, but it might see some play. Next up, we have Lumaru, a 5/2 for 1 Solar. When this Lumaru destroys an opponent's Celestial in battle, that opponent must send the top 3 cards of their deck to the Underworld. So this is Necra from Mill. Is that good? It's decent. Necra still sees plenty of play. 5 attack Elestrals at 1 cost see plenty of play right now. However, the Mill is pretty useless. So this is really just a 5 attacker, and 5 attack is like Zoo stuff is kind of on the out. I mean, we do still see some like Lavalith Zoo stuff with Viserys, Lavalith, etc. So it might be fine, but I don't think it goes in that deck. You'd rather run Necruf in that deck. So are you playing this in Mill? Most definitely. If you're playing a Mill deck, you are playing Solar Fire now with the rest of the Mill support. This card's fine in a Mill deck, if not good. This is the highest statted Mill Elestral, so you can just kind of stick it as a 5 attack wall turn 1. You don't even need to really attack with it, and you get the upside that if you do want to attack with it, you can mill some cards. That's fine. Again, mill decks aren't really trying to go for spirit damage, so the fact that you can just run over smaller Elestrals and do some mill is nice, and you can always attack things that your opponents are a little bit less resilient to use their protection to save, to try to kind of get that extra mill in. So Lumaru is fine. It's just fine. Next up is Ruminus, a 7/4 for 2 Solar. When this Ruminus deals damage to an opponent, they must send the top 3 cards from the deck to the Underworld for each spirit that they expended. I don't think this card's that great. So if you're hitting your opponent for 2 spirit damage. They're gonna mill 6. If you can hit directly with this card, they're gonna hit mill 6 generally, commonly, or you find ways to nexus to this thing a bunch and then maybe mill them for 9 or 12 by a direct hit. But again, we're asking for our opponent to basically be open to directly hit them or put a bowl of Apollo on this to hit them directly. That's a lot of steps for not a ton of mill, and it'll still get affected by counter runes. So I don't think this card's that great. I think it's fine, but I think if you're playing mill, you're playing a lot of 1-drops that you don't really need to get to ascend. To mill, there's only 1 2-drop in the mill deck that I think you'd want to play, and that was the Humburst. So Rinus is fine, but I don't think it's going to see any play. Next up is Soulbell, a 1/4 for 1 solar. When you foretell, you may special ascend this Soulbell to a foretold soul stocks. Your Apollo's effects that foretell cards reveal an additional 2 cards. Allows your Apollo to reveal 5 cards, and you can add 1 to your hand. That is a solar Elestral. That's pretty powerful in general. Like, just that alone would be fine. Looking top 5, rearranging them to fix your draws, that's pretty good. Additionally, being able to special ascend into soul stocks. Now, Soul Stocks is a powerhouse, so I think Soulbell is really powerful because of Soul Stocks, and the effect of Foretell 5 on Apollo is pretty powerful. But let's look at Soul Stocks because that's really where this is going to kick in. It's a 4/7 for 2 solar. When you special cast the Soul Stocks, you can enchant 2 from the underworld to your field. You can disenchant 1 from your Apollo in order to target and destroy a card. So you use Soulbell to get this out. You're going to basically going to find it pretty consistently on the top 5. If not, you're going to use First Light to find it consistently. Special Soul Stocks into play, recover some spirits, and then you're going to basically disenchant one of the spirits you just recovered to pop something on your opponent's board. So this is almost like Kerbis in a sense, where you're just disenchanting from board. You do need to disenchant specifically from Apollo, so if your opponent has a way to deal with Apollo with like a Pegas or something, this will shut the Soul Stocks off pretty rapidly and leaving you with just a 4/7 body on board that doesn't do much. However, it does have some pretty aggressive tempo swings where you drop this into play, pop an important card on your opponent's board, maybe swing into for some damage, and then they just go, okay, now your turn and see what you can do to me. I just recovered spirits, popped a card, and played a 2-drop that might then ascend into Celis-Leo. So Soul Stocks, I think, is the better way that I mentioned to get to Celis-Leo. You just play Soul Stocks, pop a problematic card, Soul Stocks defense, pass turn, next turn comes around, you still have Soul Stocks in play, drop Celis-Leo on it, and then go from there. So I think Soul Stocks, Soulbell are going to be pretty powerful, if not frustrating to play against. Moving on next to Calf Mill, a 3/4 for 1 solar. When you ascend this Calf Mill or it's destroyed, you can return 3 spirits in combination of solar or lunar from your underworld to your spirit deck. This is basically Quackle or Sluggle, but slower but also more diverse. So it's got better stats than both of them because the trigger is not on a cast. It's specifically when this is destroyed or ascended. So basically, if this leaves play and goes to the underworld, you can recover 3 spirits, which is pretty thematic to the Camel line. I think this card's decent because, I mean, as a wall, you just drop into play. Maybe you can play some cards after it. Like if you're playing your counter runes during your opponent's turn, it's nice that this doesn't recover till after. So turn 1, you play this in defense, maybe a poison tipped arrow and some other shenanigans. It gives you the option to spend some spirits during your opponent's turn to recover after this card's played. Unlike where Sluggle, you might go like Nectar of the Gods into Sluggle. At least you can go with this card like Nectar of the Gods first, play Calf Mill and a PTA, then your PTA expend, Calf Mill dies, recover your 3, then pay your cost for PTA, etc. So there's some pros and cons to Sluggle and Quackle. 4 defense does make this super relevant in that department, and recovery is always just nice, and this is a really interesting way to do recovery. I'm going to skip the other 2 camels because I talked about them in the lunar spot, so we're going to go into Corvishine, a 2/4 for 1 solar. When this Corvishine receives 1 or more solar, you can foretell cards equal to the number of spirits enchanting at +1. So when you play this card, you're generally going to foretell 2. Then you can draw a card, and you can put a card from your hand on top of your deck. This lets you look at the top 2, 3, etc. cards at the top of your deck, whatever many spirits it has, +1. Say, cool, I'm going to order it this way. Then I'm going to draw one of those cards and put another card from my hand on top of my deck. So what this really allows you to do is just basically trade a card from the top of your like X cards of your deck with the card in your hand, which is pretty cool. I think this card is going to be interesting. I don't know how much play it'll see. It's nice that in Solar you have an option. This is kind of like a pseudo janky Ash Rabbit, where the pros to this is you're not getting rid of the cards, but with Ash Rabbit, you might want to get rid of those cards. I don't know. I think this card's going to see at least some play just for the fact that it's going to work pretty well with the Nexus stuff. Being able to kind of look at the top X cards of your deck, rearrange them, and grab a card and trade it with the card in your hand. Maybe you find a way to use this to sculpt the top of your deck for like Celis-Leo plays where you're kind of getting ready for Celis-Leo, so you use this effect by nexusing to it, sculpt the top of your deck, put an Elestral back on top of your deck, grab a rune off the top of your deck, so when you go to Celis-Leo, you can say, oh, look, more Elestrals, who would have guessed? So I think the card's fine. It is a little combo-centric with a bunch of other cards in Solar. We'll have to see if that's good enough. But it is a little clunky at times, and it might be a little slow, but it's interesting for sure. Next up, Plucky, 1/4 for 1 Solar. When you normal cast this Plucky, you can search your deck for a Divine Rune, add to your hand. Elechic 2.0, we already know Elechic is powerful. I think Plucky is actually a decent chunk worse than Elechic. However, being in Solar does make it relevant for Solar decks. If you're a little tight on Spirits and Thunder Spirits particularly, it is decent to be able to not have to go into the Thunder Spirit for Elechic. However, Elechic is a little bit nicer because if you grab a Zeus or Demeter or something with the Elechic, it does get some pretty beefy stats to punch over things. Plucky will sit in defense and just sit in defense. After the fact, if there's a deck that this sees play, it's either a deck that's already running multiple Elechics or it's a deck that requires multiple Solar Elestrals to be in the deck for advantage, i.e. a Solar deck that wants Solar Elestrals on top of the deck for card advantage. So I think it'll basically only see play in very Solar heavy decks. Otherwise, you just run Elechic instead. Next up, we have Exaltus, a 3/2 for 1 Solar. You can nexus 2 Solar. When you do, you can search your deck for an Astrabbit and add it to your hand. An Ethereal Elestral and add it to your hand. So yes, the big thing with this card, people are saying, oh, you search Astrabbit. However, I don't know how effective searching an Astrabbit off an Apollo plus Exaltus combo for your next turn to be another defensive play is going to be worth it. There are other good Ethereal Elestrals to find. Many of the good Solar Elestrals in the Nexus deck are going to be Ethereal, so I think you have a spot there. Again, you have Astrabbit. Just of note, the Ethereal subtype is the most common subtype in the game by far. So there's a lot of cards you can find with this card. So if you are playing some kind of combo deck that requires Ethereal Elestrals, or just happen to have a critical mass of Ethereal Elestrals that you need to find, or a combo piece you need to find, and you're in Solar, this card's fine. I think this is going to see play in like Solar Nexus to grab some kind of interesting Ethereal pieces in Solar, or maybe just you grab Astrabbit with it and have a day. But I think the card's really good. I think it's a card that's going to get better as long as we get more Solar Ethereal Elestrals, and we'll have to see how that goes down the line. Next up is Cyprol, a 4/1 for 1 Solar. When you cast a Cyprol, you can search your deck for Golden Fleece, cast it, empowering the Cyprol, using spirits from your spirit deck and or Underworld to cast the Golden Fleece. This card is really good just for the fact that you can cast Golden Fleece from your deck and recover spirits to make an automatic Nexus bank on board from your Underworld for cost. Like, this is a little bit of a Sluggle, Quackle, Dratagua situation where you're healing spirits from Underworld and you're putting them on board instead, which is powerful. Combine that with the Altar of the Stars, combine that with Circle of the Skies, and the other good cards that are Nexus fodder in Solar. I think Cyprol is pretty powerful. I would expect Cyprol to be a 1 or 2 of in those Solar decks that want to get Nexus banks, and you can search this off Exaltus. So Exaltus searches out another Nexus bank, so you don't always have to use Apollo, and you heal 2 spirits to board with this, allowing you to kind of set up for other counter rune plays. I think that's what makes Cyprol pretty powerful. If you're just running this out turn 1, expecting to ascend into a Lustragon with it, that's fine. Like, the protection off Golden Fleece is fine for 1 turn to ascend something into, but generally this card's going to be best if you can go like Nectar of the Gods, then play this, get the 1 of maybe 2 of Golden Fleece out of your deck, recover those 2 spirits from Nog back onto board, and then get ready for an Altar play that way, so you're not stuck always putting Apollo into play for Nexus banks in Solar. That's, I think, what's going to really help out the Solar Nexus deck, is there's just multiple ways to get banks onto board outside of just Apollo. Next up, we have Helth, a 5/5 for 2 Solar. This Helth can be normal cast with 2 Solar if an artifact is enchanted. When you cast this Helth, you can turn an Elestral on the field to its owner's hand. Alright, so let's start with the fact that it doesn't target for that bounce. That's really, really powerful. However, if you are playing this card, it is going to be a side deck only, I think, all-star card. If you're playing it in your main deck with like a Cyprol or some other artifact-based main deck, the fact that you have to play an Elestral first to empower is going to be a little awkward. There's a world where you use an artifact to empower your opponent's Elestral so that you then can normal cast this Helith. So this Helith can kind of turn your artifacts into removal. So there might be a world where you run like a Helith aggro deck-ish, where you're allowing to trade your artifacts into removal, along with the rest of the artifact deck that you're playing. But outside of a deck that you are specifically playing artifacts in, this card's not going to be super great, except in a side deck. If an artifact deck is there and powerful, this will allow you to side this into the artifact matchup to bounce, the artifact or an Elestral with an artifact on it without targeting, so that Guardian of the Fleece, I don't believe, can activate to chain to this effect, which is where this card will shine, but that's a meta call. So if this card is good, it's because artifacts in general are a pretty powerful deck, or you are playing an artifact deck that seeks to get some extra removal out of it. 5/5 stats leave a lot to be desired at a 2-drop, but it does come out as a normal cast and with a removal effect attached to it, kind of like a Lavalith. So yeah, you're bouncing Elestral. It's a Lavalith for artifact and powered things. I don't know. It's going to be interesting. We'll see. But the card's fine. It does get cracked back pretty easily by most other cards, so we'll have to see. Alright, next up, we got the Divine Rune Apollo finally. It's a 1-cost Divine Rune, as they all are. When you cast this Apollo, you can enchant 3 solar to it, nothing out of the ordinary there. And its effect is you can disenchant solar from this card to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, add 1 solar Celestial Foretell this way to your hand, and put the rest on top in any order. Effectively, that's what Foretell is, that's what the card does. This card's pretty good. People are going to equate this to Ash Rabbit. It's significantly weaker than Ash Rabbit. The fact that Ash Rabbit shuffles is usually upside because you grab the best card off the top 3 and then shuffle. In this case, letting you see 2 other cards and maybe adding 1 to your hand and then reorganizing them on top of your deck is interesting. However, there is going to be the problem occasionally with these solo decks where they see 3 cards on top of their deck they don't want or need in the moment, and they have no way to shuffle them back into their deck, and you get stuck with them. So that is a problem with Solar in general, but I don't know how relevant it's going to be, because when this card hits, it hits real hard and it's really good. You can combine this with First Light to turn this basically into an Aeolus, where you're searching for an Elestral and adding it to your hand, because you go First Light, put it on top of deck, Apollo, add it from hand, or top deck to hand. Apollo is just very good. I think Apollo is going to be pretty powerful. I think it's kind of in the line of, it's an Aeolus. It's a weaker Aeolus, but for the weaker effect, in general, it's a cheaper cost. So we'll have to see how it goes out. But there's a lot of cards that also in Solar want to use Nexus Bank. So in general, I think Apollo is powerful. And combined with things like Soul Bell and Soul Socks, it gets even stronger. So although it has some weaker than Aeolus effects, it also gets stronger than Aeolus in a lot of other ways, with the entire element concerning itself and yada yada yada. It's a really good card, as are most of the Divines. Next up, Bowl of Apollo. It's a 1-cost artifact. The Empowered Celestial can attack opponent's spirit deck directly. When Apollo is enchanted and the Empowered Celestial deals damage to an opponent, you can return 1 solar from your underworld to your spirit deck. This card's interesting. So allowing you to attack directly. What if we have in the game to attack directly right now? Zephyrog and Christboar, which we have seen a little bit of play. Just a little bit. So attacking directly is not the end of the world. However, you still need to get through shields and Gorgons, etc. with the Elestral that you're empowering with this bow. I don't think this bow will see much play at all in solar decks. I do think that this is a pretty interesting one-of in the Blazers OTK deck, but I'm not sold on it. So obviously in Blazers OTK, you already play Hephaestus for your Exalt Fair combo to get to Blazerous, and then Hephaestus can go and search a Bowl of Apollo before you go into combo, giving your Blazerous that has 4 or 5 spirits on it the ability to attack directly twice, which is pretty powerful. Combine that with the Helios before you go into the combo like you normally do. That is pretty powerful to just get over your opponent's Elestrals, direct attack for a bunch of damage. That's going to be pretty good. I don't know if you play Bowl of Apollo in that deck for the fact that you do still play the one of Trifernal in the Blazers OTK deck. And a lot of the times, going Helios into 2 attack position Elestrals on board will be significantly more damage than going Bow of Apollo and attacking directly, because the ability to attack over attack position Elestral twice for, let's say, 3 damage each, and then ascending into Trifernal from that will let you hit again. That additional hit from Trifernal is probably worth more than Bow of Apollo, but you can run both in the same deck. So if you do need to get in directly because they have defense position Elestrals, this will let you do that. Now, I think that's the best case for Bow of Apollo. Maybe you put this on Ruminous, So that's the best case for Apollo. We already know Blazers of TK as a deck is mediocre. It's like maybe tier 2, 2.5 at most because of how much board presence it just gives up and the fact that you need to find combo in the first few turns or you lose the game. This adds another piece to combo that you can search off of Festus, which does increase the cost of the combo, but it's there and relevant. Otherwise, this card's probably not great, but it would be interesting to see how much play it sees in like a fire solar artifact deck. Next up, we have the Golden Fleece that we were talking about with Cyprol. It's a 2-cost artifact. This Empowered Elestral gets +2 defense. If the Empowered Elestral will be destroyed in battle or by its opponent's card effect, you can destroy Golden Fleece instead. This blocks from 1 Earthquake, this blocks from 1 Boom Bow, 1 Chronodile. It blocks one of some kind of destruction effect on one specific Elestral. As a protection card, this card's okay. In the deck that you play this card, you're running maybe 1 or 2 of it to search out with Cyprol or maybe with Argo. Decks that I could see this being run unironically in would be Solar Nexus, because you can get it out with Cyprol. Maybe you can run this in Mill, because if you can put this on a Burst with an Argo, so it doesn't die, and you get the Mill 4 there, that could be relevant, but that is pretty expensive. And we already know that like Mill is already kind of expensive in general, so I don't know how great that would be, but I think there's hope that this card might just go in a Humbust and just sit there. In an artifact-based deck, which we have all this artifact support in the set, this might be enough to just put a 1-of with your other artifacts that you do want to run in the artifact-based deck, just as that extra protection effect from attacks with Argo, or as a 1-of to search off like Hephaestus to pop it on something that you want to live for a turn, or to make your opponent kind of really struggle to out something after they've already burned a bunch of other removal. So I think the card is good, not great. It's fantastic with Cyprol and Solar Nexus, though. Next up, First Light. I spoke about this earlier. It's a 1-cost Invoke Rune for Solar. You search your deck for a Solar Celestial, put it on top of your deck. Pretty good. So you're going to search for any Solar Celestial you want, put it on top of your deck, shuffle your deck, put that card on top, and then maybe Apollo it to hand, or maybe you do your 2-drop line to get your 3-drop line out, or you put your Soul Bell on, or your Soul Stocks on top because you have Soul Bell in play. First Light is amazing for consistency, since Solar really likes fiddling with the top of their deck and that Foretell mechanic. First Light really makes a lot of those combo decks tick. It's a pretty powerful card. You can kind of look at it like an Aeolus effect for 1 cheaper, not to hand but to top of the deck. But in a lot of Solar decks, putting stuff on top of your deck is better than having it in hand if you know it's there and you can prep for it. So I think First Light's going to be really powerful in Solar decks. Well, only Solar decks and useless in everything else, but that's just how the card goes. It's definitely the piece that glues a lot of the Solar decks together in a really meaningful way. This card's going to be a 3-of in every Solar deck, if not the majority of them. Temple of Sun, it's a stadium. And lastly for the set, the last card of the set I have yet to talk about in these videos, Guardian of the Fleece. It's a good one to end off on. So it's a 2-cost counter rune. Guardian of the Fleece can only be cast when an opponent activates a card effect that targets an artifact or an Empowered Elestral on your field. Negate that effect, then destroy a card in that opponent's field. This both negates a card and destroys whatever you want on your opponent's field, not just the card that you negated. This card is crazy. Like, legitimately, this card is insane. The downside is that you need to be playing artifacts, which there is a lot of artifact support in the set, this being the key piece of it, along with Argo. Is that enough to make an artifact deck viable? I think it's just enough to make the deck at least viable, not great. But this card is going to be absolutely monstrous in the artifact deck, and with more artifacts possibly in the future, well, eventually in the future, I mean, just give it 20 dozen sets and eventually artifact support will come back around. This card looks like it might be one of the strongest cards in the deck, being able to negate a destruction effect and destroy whatever you want. This is an omni-destruction negate that protects your 4 spirits on board. Oh, this card's crazy. However, you do still need to draw it and have that set up on board, so maybe it's not that great. But it's this card, when it works, is phenomenal. Now, when it works, is phenomenal. When it's dead card, it's so bricky and useless. So I'm going to cautiously say this card is good, but I can't say this card is like 10 out of 10 amazing just because of the restriction of basically needing 4 spirits on board with an empowered Elestral to actually protect, and maybe your opponent just shields or uses their Heliolith to bounce something so it's not targeted, or use some other non-targeting removal, or just like Vertakwa something and attack it, destroy it that way. So I think the card is going to be very good, but the downsides to the card are pretty heavy. Alright, so that is every single solar and water card in the set, and this is the end of the entire set review. The 2 other videos went over the other 6 elements, so check out those if you want. This video is pretty long, so if you're still here, wow, say pineapple in the comments if you're still here at the end of this video. And other than that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for sticking around for this very long video.